Okay, welcome back, guys. This is part 2 of the Chapter 11 video. So, the most important topic here, what we're going to talk about kind of for the rest of this chapter, is the idea of money and this equation of exchange. So, the equation of exchange is a very important concept for understanding money and the money supply and monetary policy, which is the way the government kind of controls the economy, or one of the ways the government controls the economy. So the equation itself is pretty simple. It's MV equals PY, where M represents the money supply. So that's a key concept. Money supply, the way economists define it, is the amount of money in circulation and readily spendable. Okay, so it's not all of GDP, it's not net worth, it's how much money do you have that you could actually, that's liquid, that you could put your hands on and spend immediately. So for example, I've got a bunch of money put away for retirement in 401ks and 403bs and things like that, but I can't touch that without huge penalties. I own some equity in my house, but I can't spend that without selling my house, and that takes a long time. So the money supply is more like what's in your checking account, cash that you have on hand, that sort of thing. So that's what the money supply means. We'll talk more about that shortly. V is the velocity of money. So it's basically the number of times each dollar is spent, each dollar in circulation, the money supply, gets spent and respent within a year. Economists generally assume that to be fairly fixed, pretty constant from one year to the next, so we don't have to worry too much about V there, just understand what that is. It's like if you could literally track a dollar bill and see how many times it gets spent and respent within a year, that's the velocity of money. So if you take, well, we'll come back to that. P is the average price level. So it's kind of like some of the price indices we've looked at, like implicit price deflator or the consumer price index, just kind of a measure of overall average price level. And then Y is real GDP, so actual physical output. So if we take all that together, MV, the left half of this equation, is really total spending. Okay, so if we take the amount of spendable money in the economy, multiply it by the number of times it gets spent, that's a measure of total spending. PY is really total output or nominal GDP, because it's like average price level multiplied times all the stuff produced. That gives you a measure of total output. So really all this equation is saying is total spending must equal total output. That's exactly what that circular flow diagram taught us a couple of chapters ago. So the idea behind this is pretty simple and should make sense. It's a pretty simple equation, and it kind of has to be true, so that's helpful. So here's an example of how this works and how this equation is helpful. So remember, MV equals PY, that's our equation. Notice that V now has a little bar over it. That indicates that velocity is remaining constant, because we pretty much assume and have found that the velocity of money doesn't really change much from one year to the next. So just for an example, assume that real GDP is growing at 5%. So the economy's output's growing 5%. That's Y. So the Y part of this equation is growing 5%. Assume that the money supply, which is controlled by the government, is growing at 2%. So the government's letting the money supply expand at about 2%. So since velocity is fixed, that means the left half of our equation, M times V, is also growing at 2%. So if the left half of the equation is growing 2%, the right half must be growing at 2%. So if output is growing 5%, what must be happening to P? It must be decreasing by around 3%. So the point here is the way the government manages the money supply really goes a long way toward determining the rate of change in prices. In this case, they're creating deflation of prices, which might sound good, but it's actually not a good thing. So what should the government do if it wants stable prices? If you want the inflation rate to be 0 and prices to remain the same? Think about that for a second. Look at the equation. Basically, you need to allow the money supply to grow or decline at the same rate as real output. So, our example above, if output's growing 5% and the money supply grows 5% and velocity is constant, then prices will remain constant. So this is a big part of how the government exercises monetary policy, which we'll talk quite a bit more about soon. Your book spends a lot of time on this. It kind of just makes the same point, but you can rewrite this equation several ways. Instead of being multiplication, they turn it into percent changes, and it's not exactly true. That's the reason for the little squiggly equal signs, but the percent change in M plus percent change in V equals percent change in P plus percent change in Y, roughly. And then it rewrites it a couple ways. But the bottom line, if you look at that bottom equation on the screen here, it makes that same point, that controlling the size and the growth of the money supply largely determines the rate of inflation. So if we see inflation, it's the government's fault. They've screwed up. They should be better than that. And they're getting better, so let's be honest. Okay, so we'll come back to money supply and monetary policy in the next chapter. One of the last points I want to go over here is the study guide tells you that you should understand why the Phillips curve in the long run is vertical. So this is meant to explain that. Remember that in the long run aggregate supply is fixed and shown by the vertical purple line in panel A. It's fixed at the level of potential output, the level of production that would produce if all of our factors of production are fully employed. So that's vertical. It's fixed at any given point in time. So if we have a quick increase in aggregate demand that causes some inflation and causes the economy to kind of have a growth spurt, that may cause the unemployment rate to go down in the short run. But remember, in the long run, what tends to happen here is prices go up, production costs go up, and that increases, well, production costs go up, so it shifts the short run aggregate supply curve back to the left. So we'll end up, I should have had this ready, we'll end up, for a short time moving to point 2, but in the long run, as production costs for businesses increase, we'll move back here to what I'm going to call point 3, but this higher level of equilibrium. So the point is, in the long run, increasing inflation does not necessarily decrease unemployment. For a short period of time, it might, but in the long run, employment is going to be at the natural level of employment and at the natural rate of output. So that's the reason in the long run, the Phillips curve is vertical. Hope that makes sense. If not, as always, please ask me questions. There's some more stuff I'm not going over in the video, but there's some different types of unemployment: frictional, structural, and cyclical. And the end of the chapter talks about the causes for all those, but it's pretty simple. I think you can read it for yourself, so I'm not going to go over those. So that ends our chapter 11 video. Thanks, and as always, let me know if you have any questions. Whoa.